Look, I'm not going to give you any real names because we did some pretty sketchy stuff out there in the desert. But you can call me Jay, that's close enough for government work, you know what I mean. First thing you've got to understand about me is that I hate the heat. I mean, I truly despise it. Can't stand the sun beating down on you like some angry god trying to melt your brain into soup. And I'm never, ever going back to the Southwest. Not for all the green chili and hatch chiles. Not for all the silver and the sunsets. Not for anything. You see, I still get these nightmares, man. They come when the sun's getting low and turning all orange and nasty, when those clouds light up like cotton candy at some twisted carnival. In these dreams, I'm back out there sweating bullets. There are these things, dark things, deep underground in the desert. And the heat's like molten lead pouring over everything. I wake up drenched in sweat, even when it's snowing outside my apartment here in Portland. But back in 2005, when I was 19 and thought I was hot stuff. Dude, I believed nothing bad would ever happen to me. I had that bravado that comes with being young and stupid, you know. Thought I was invincible. Thought the world owed me something just for showing up. I was living in a town in New Mexico, not going to say which one. It's safer that way. I was couch surfing, staying with some shady people, and doing whatever odd jobs I could find to keep myself in ramen and weed money. You see, I had been on the outs with my parents since I came out to them the year before. I told them straight up, look, I'm not super picky. Sometimes I like hot dudes, and sometimes I like hot chicks. Real diplomatic like that. My folks completely flipped out. They started going on about sin and hell and how I was going to burn for eternity. You would have thought I told them I was going to become a serial killer or something. So they kicked me out when I turned 18. And there I was, just being young and dumb in the high desert, hanging with my friends, getting blazed, and thinking I had all the time in the world to get my life together. The heat was always there, pressing down on you like a weight, making everything shimmer and dance in the distance. But I figured I would adapt, you know. Thought I'd grow into it like a lizard or something. I was zonked most of the time anyway, so the heat just felt like part of the haze. Plus, I was 19 and immortal, right? What could go wrong? Holy crap, man. If I could go back in time and slap some sense into that kid. But everybody thinks that, you know. So I'm living this hand-to-mouth existence, right? Doing landscaping one day, helping somebody move the next, whatever kept me in gas money and munchies. But the work was drying up faster than spit on a sidewalk in July. And I was getting desperate. That's when my dealer, let's call him Miguel, told me he knew a guy who had some work. Under the table stuff. Good money, no questions asked. It's like manual labor, Miguel said, passing me this gnarly joint that tasted like it was rolled in old socks. But it pays cash, and it pays good. I was blazed enough to think this sounded legit, so I said, sure, hook me up. The meeting was at this rundown diner on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the coffee tastes like it was filtered through dirty gym socks and the pie looks older than the waitress. I headed in around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sweating through my shirt after walking across town. The guy was sitting in a back booth, and dude, he was off. Like, seriously off. His skin was pale as a fish belly, which was trippy as hell because everybody out here gets burnt to leather just walking to their mailbox. His eyes were this pale blue, so light they were almost white, like looking into winter ice. But his hair was jet black, slicked back with so much pomade that it looked like an oil spill. You must be the young man Miguel recommended, he said in a voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. No accent that I could place, just flat. He tells me you work well, keep your mouth shut, and don't make waves. Yeah, that's me, I said, sliding into the booth across from him. The vinyl was cracked and sticky, and I could feel my thighs already starting to sweat against it. What kind of work are we talking about? He leaned forward, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Oh, desert work. Manual labor. You and a small crew will drive out to a remote location, spend one night camping, complete a job, and return. The pay is $10,000. My brain practically short-circuited. 10 grand for one night of work. I was making maybe $300 a week when I was lucky. This job had more red flags than a Chinese parade, but for $10,000, I was in. What's the catch? I asked, because I wasn't totally stupid. No catch. Just hard work in difficult conditions. You'll need to be prepared for the heat. His pale eyes fixed on mine, and I felt like a bug under a microscope. Can you handle the heat? The way he said it made my skin crawl, but for $10,000, man, that was like hitting the lottery. Yeah, I lied. I can handle anything. He slid a business card across the table. It was blank except for an address. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. And just like that, he stood up and walked out, leaving me sitting there wondering what the hell I had just signed up for. The next morning, I walked up to this warehouse on the industrial side of town. The kind of place that looks abandoned but has too many fresh tire tracks in the dirt to actually be empty. The sun was already making the asphalt shimmer, and it wasn't even 8 a.m. yet. There was a white box truck parked outside and 3 other guys standing around looking about as confused as I felt. Man, this is some serious hardware, said this stocky Hispanic dude with tattoos covering his forearms. He stuck out his hand. I'm Pedro. Jay, I said, shaking it. His grip was solid, calloused from real work. The other Hispanic guy introduced himself as Xavier, a quiet type with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. And then there was Red, who had that weathered look of someone who'd spent his whole life under the desert sun. Native features, but I had no idea which tribe. And finally, Kate, who I could tell right away was the Heifa, the boss lady. Short, built like a fire hydrant, with arms that looked like she could bench press a Honda. All right, listen up, Kate said, tapping items on a clipboard. It's a 3-hour drive to the site. We're packing food, water, and camping gear because we're staying overnight. This is serious business, not some weekend camping trip. Anyone who can't handle that needs to walk away right now. Nobody walked. Good. Now load up. She started directing us to load equipment into the back of the truck, a winch, a sledgehammer, coils of rope as thick as my wrist, pulleys, camping gear, and enough water jugs to fill a swimming pool. Are we riding in the back of the truck, too? I asked. No, in the stretch limo we're renting, she replied sarcastically. Of course in the truck. This isn't a pleasure cruise. The drive was brutal, man. Kate drove while the rest of us sweated in the back like sardines in a can. No AC, just the tiny hatch from the front propped open, hot air blowing through like a hairdryer set to hell. I kept chugging water and watching the landscape get more and more alien as we headed further from civilization. Every so often, Kate would pick up the CB radio and say something in code. Blue jay to eagle's nest, checking in, or cactus flowers clear. Always got a response in the same cryptic BS. It made my paranoid stoner brain start spinning all kinds of theories about what we were really doing out here. Where exactly are we going? I asked Pedro, who was sitting across from me, mopping sweat off his forehead with a bandana. Way out near the lava fields, he said. Near the Malpais. You know, there are dead volcanoes out there on the border. I didn't know that either until today. Xavier looked up from where he'd been staring at the equipment. Volcanic activity stopped maybe 3,000 years ago. Left behind all these lava tubes and formations. It's the perfect place to hide things. Hide what? I asked, but he just shrugged. Red spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet and gravelly. People get killed on gigs like this. The money talks louder than common sense. That should have been my first real warning, but I was 19 and stupid, already counting my $10,000 in my head. The heat was making me dizzy, and I just wanted to get wherever we were going so I could get out of that rolling oven and into some shade. We pulled up to the site around 10 a.m., and I have to say, it was like landing on Mars. Nothing but black volcanic rock stretching to the horizon, twisted into weird shapes by ancient fires. The heat hit us like a physical thing when we opened the truck doors, and I immediately started sweating harder than I ever had in my life. Set up camp in the shade of that outcropping, Kate ordered, pointing to some rocks that cast maybe 6 feet of shadow. And drink water constantly. I don't want anybody dropping from heat stroke. I started joking around with Pedro and Xavier, trying to lighten the mood, but Kate shut that down fast. Stow that junk and stay focused, she snapped. This is serious business. People have died out here for being careless. Something in her tone made my blood run cold despite the heat. This wasn't just about moving rocks or digging holes. This was something else entirely. And I was about to find out what. After we set up camp, and I use the term loosely because it was basically just throwing our sleeping bags in the only patch of shade we could find, Kate gathered us around and started handing out gear, heavy work gloves, headlamps, and more water bottles. "We're going about 200 yards that way," she said, pointing toward what looked like absolutely nothing, just more twisted black rock under the merciless sun. "There's a hidden canyon in the lava fields. You'd walk right past it and never see it if you didn't know it was there." She was right. We trudged through the heat for a few minutes, sweat pouring off us like we were melting, and I was starting to think she was leading us to our deaths when suddenly the ground just opened up. 1 second, we're walking on solid volcanic rock. The next, there's this crack in the earth, maybe 6 feet wide, with boulders and overhangs creating natural cover. "Whoa," Pedro muttered, peering down into the darkness. "How the hell did anyone find this place?" Kate went down first and then called up for us to follow. The canyon was maybe 30 feet deep, and the second I hit bottom, the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. It was still hot as blazes, but compared to the surface, it felt like walking into air conditioning. "This way," Kate said, leading us toward what looked like a crack in the canyon wall. As we got closer, I realized it was actually the mouth of a cave, a lava tube, probably formed when molten rock flowed through here thousands of years ago. Xavier was running his hands along the entrance. "This isn't natural," he said quietly. "Someone carved this wider. Look at the tool marks." He was right. The edges of the opening had been chiseled and smoothed, widened from whatever natural formation had been there originally. "A Spanish colonist," Kate said, switching on her headlamp. "We're here to dig up some artifacts they left behind." And that's when it hit me what we were really doing out here. "Oh crap," I said, the reality sinking in through my heat-addled brain. "We're grave robbers, aren't we?" Kate shrugged. "I call it archaeological recovery, but yeah, basically. You got a problem with that?" I thought about the $10,000 waiting for me, and I shook my head. "Nah, man. Dead Spanish dudes don't need their stuff anymore, right? I've worked a couple of sites where people got hurt doing exactly this kind of off-the-books digging," Red said, looking at me with a serious gaze. "We need to be careful." We headed into the lava tube, our headlamps cutting through absolute darkness. The cave opened up into a section that was wider than I expected, maybe 40 feet across with a sandy floor and a massive stone ceiling that disappeared into black above our lights. The walls were rough volcanic rock, but they had been carved out in places, smoothed and shaped by human hands. "Start digging here," Kate said, pointing to a spot in the center of the cave floor where the sand looked different, darker, more compacted. We dug for 2 hours in that sweltering underground oven, taking turns with the shovels and chugging water like our lives depended on it, which, looking back, they probably did. Pedro was the first to hit something solid. "Got something," he called out, scraping sand away with his hands. "Big something." What we uncovered made my blood run cold despite the heat. It was a sarcophagus, stone, about 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, a foot or so deep. But it wasn't like any Spanish artifact I'd seen in museums or textbooks. This thing was weird. The stone was some kind of dark volcanic rock, almost black, covered in carvings that hurt to look at. No Spanish writing or crosses or anything Christian. These were symbols that seemed to twist and writhe in the light of our headlamps. "That don't look Spanish to me," Xavier said, echoing my thoughts. "A Spanish colonist found a lot of indigenous artifacts," Kate said. But even she sounded uncertain. "Probably Anasazi or Pueblo. Pre-Columbian." Red was standing at the edge of our excavation, staring down at the sarcophagus with a curious expression. "That's not Anasazi," he said quietly. "That's not Pueblo. That's not anything from any tribe I know." The thing felt wrong in every possible way. Despite being buried in sand in a cave where the temperature had to be pushing 90 degrees, the stone was cold to the touch, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. And it was heavy. We'd barely uncovered half of it, and already I could tell this thing weighed a ton. "How are we supposed to move this?" I asked, wiping sweat out of my eyes. "It's got to weigh like 2,000 pounds. "Well, that's what the winch is for," Kate said. "We rig pulleys to the ceiling, use the truck as an anchor point outside. It's going to take all 5 of us and most of the afternoon, but we can do it." Pedro was running his hands over the carved symbols, frowning. "These markings, they're not worn down like you'd expect from something that old. It's like they were carved yesterday." "Maybe because it's so dry," Xavier said, but he didn't sound convinced. I was about to say something else when Red spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't be doing this. This is federal jurisdiction." FBI-level stuff. My brother-in-law got 2 years for it. Too late for second thoughts, Kate said firmly. We've got a job to do. But as we rigged the pulleys and prepared for the long haul of dragging that cursed thing out of its resting place, I couldn't shake the feeling that Red was right. The sarcophagus seemed to radiate a strange sense of dread, like it was sucking the life out of the air around it. And the symbols, God, those symbols. Even now, 20 years later, I can still see them when I close my eyes. They seem to move in my peripheral vision, shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. We should have listened to Red. We should have filled that hole back in and walked away. But we didn't. And what happened next? Well, that's when things really went to hell. Underscore 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 underscore. It took us until sunset to get that cursed thing out of the cave and drag it to our campsite. Even with the truck and the winch, even with the pulleys and the sledge, even with all 5 of us working in shifts, it was absolutely brutal work. The sarcophagus fought us every inch of the way, like it wanted to stay buried. The ropes kept slipping, the pulleys jammed, and twice we had to re-rig the whole system when anchor points failed. By the time we had it pulled to camp and covered with a heavy canvas tarp, we were all dead on our feet. The sun was setting behind the volcanic peaks, painting the sky the color of dried blood, and the temperature was finally starting to drop from surface of mercury to just inside an oven. Tomorrow, we'll drag this up the ramps into the truck and get the hell out of here, Kate said, cracking open a warm beer from the cooler. Even she looked wiped out, her usual fire hydrant intensity dimmed by exhaustion and heat. Pedro was already working on getting a fire started, stacking mesquite branches in a ring of volcanic rocks. Man, I can't wait to get back to civilization, he said, striking a match. First thing I'm going to do is find the biggest, coldest swimming pool and just live in it for a week. What are you going to do with your cut, Jay? Xavier asked, settling down in a sleeping bag and pulling off his work boots. His feet were pale and wrinkled with sweat. I was chugging what felt like my 12th bottle of water of the day, trying to replace what felt like half my body weight in lost fluids. Dude, I'm going to get an apartment with an air conditioner the size of a Buick and never leave. Maybe get a little refrigerator just for beer. Live like a king in climate-controlled comfort. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like the symbols on that cursed sarcophagus. We were all exhausted, but there was a strange energy in the air, a tension that went beyond mere physical fatigue. Red hadn't said a word since we'd covered the sarcophagus. He just sat staring at the canvas-shrouded shape, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. You okay, man? I asked, passing him a bottle of water. He took it but didn't open it. This is wrong, he said quietly. That thing, it doesn't belong here. It doesn't belong anywhere. Xavier looked up from sharpening his knife. It's just a rock, Red. An old, heavy rock. You didn't feel it, Red insisted. When we were moving it. The cold, it went right through my gloves. Like handling death itself. Pedro laughed, but it sounded forced. Come on, man. You're letting the desert get to you. It's just the heat and the exhaustion talking. But I knew what Red meant. Even now, sitting 20 feet from the covered sarcophagus, I could feel it, a subtle pull, like a low-grade magnetic field tugging at the edges of my awareness. The symbols seemed to burn in my mind's eye, their twisted forms refusing to fade. I'm telling you, Red continued, his voice gaining intensity, my people have stories about places like this. About things that were buried for a reason. Things that should never be disturbed. Kate stood up abruptly. Enough. We're all tired. We've got a big day tomorrow. Let's get some sleep. She started assigning watch shifts. I'll take first watch. Pedro, you're second. Xavier, third. Red and Jay, you get to sleep through. Nobody argued. The thought of being alone out here with that thing was enough to make my skin crawl. I crawled into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easy. The ground was hard, the air was still hot, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those symbols twisting in the darkness behind my eyelids. It must have been around midnight when I finally drifted off, but my sleep was fitful, haunted by dreams of dark places and colder depths. I woke with a start sometime later, my heart pounding. The fire had died down to embers, and the moon had risen, casting the volcanic landscape in silver and shadow. Pedro was on watch, sitting by the fire pit, but his head was nodding. Then I saw it. The canvas tarp covering the sarcophagus was moving. Not much, just a subtle shifting, like something breathing underneath. I sat up slowly, my sleeping bag rustling in the quiet. "Pedro," I whispered, but he didn't stir. The movement under the tarp became more pronounced. Now it looked less like breathing and more like struggling. Like something was trying to get out. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking. "Pedro," I said, louder this time. He jerked awake. "What? What is it?" I pointed at the sarcophagus just as the tarp slid off one corner, revealing the dark, carved stone beneath. The symbol seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, pulsing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. "Que carajo?" Pedro muttered, scrambling to his feet. We watched, frozen, as the symbols began to move. Not just seem to move, actually move, shifting across the stone surface like snakes slithering over rock. Then the temperature dropped. It happened so fast it stole my breath. One moment it was a typical warm desert night, the next, our breath was pluming in the air, and frost was forming on the rocks around the sarcophagus. "Wake everyone up," Pedro said, his voice tight with fear. I didn't need telling twice. I shook Red and Xavier awake while Pedro went to rouse Kate. "What's going on?" Kate asked, her voice groggy with sleep until she saw her breath misting in the air. "What the hell?" We all stood there, huddled together, watching as the sarcophagus continued its slow, impossible transformation. The symbols weren't just moving now, they were rearranging themselves, forming new patterns that made even less sense than the originals. Then we heard it. A sound from inside the stone. A faint scratching, like fingernails on rock. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. But it grew steadily louder, more insistent. Scritch, scratch, tap. "Something's in there," Xavier whispered, his scientific curiosity warring with primal fear. "No," Red said, his face pale in the moonlight. "Something wants out." The scratching became more frantic, now accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the stone and into the ground beneath our feet. Kate made a decision. "We're leaving. Now. Forget the money. We're getting out of here." But as we turned to pack our gear, the scratching stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise. We froze, waiting. Then, from the sarcophagus, came a voice, dry as dust, ancient as the volcanic rock around us, speaking words in a language that shouldn't exist. And in that moment, we all knew the same terrible truth. We hadn't just disturbed a grave. We'd awakened something. And it was very, very hungry. "Maybe get a little refrigerator just for beer," I continued, trying to lighten the mood. "Live like a king in climate-controlled comfort." 10 grand goes fast, Red said quietly. He'd been even more withdrawn since we uncovered the sarcophagus, sitting apart from the group and staring at that tarp-covered shape like it might sprout legs and walk away. "I hope it's worth pissing off the feds." "Come on, hermano," Pedro said, getting the fire going properly. The flames cast dancing shadows across the black volcanic rock. "This is easy money." Kate was digging through the food supplies, pulling out cans of beans and packages of hot dogs. "Red, what are you going to use the money for?" "I'm behind on my truck payments and I need to keep working, plus my kids' meds." But he didn't continue, just sat there watching the fire. "You know what I'm going to do," Xavier said, accepting a beer from Kate. "I'm going to take my girl Maria to Vegas, get a nice hotel room with a view. We'll eat at those fancy buffets and maybe try my luck at the tables. She's been wanting to go forever." "Vegas in the summer?" Pedro laughed, stabbing hot dogs with a stick to roast them over the fire. "That's like trading one oven for another." "Yeah, but Vegas has casinos with AC that you could hang meat in, and pools, and room service." Xavier grinned. "Besides, Maria looks good in a bikini." Even Kate cracked a smile at that. The mood was lighter as the sun went down and the oppressive heat finally started to ease up. The beans were bubbling in a pot over the fire, mixing with the smell of roasting hot dogs and mesquite smoke. After the brutal day we'd had, it felt almost normal, like we were just a bunch of friends camping in the desert instead of grave robbers who just dug up something that made my skin crawl. What about you? I asked Kate. What's the boss lady going to do with her cut? She was quiet for a moment, stirring the beans with a long-handled spoon. Pay off some debt. Maybe take a real vacation somewhere with trees and actual grass. Haven't seen green in so long, I'm starting to forget what it looks like. Where'd you grow up? Pedro asked, handing around the roasted hot dogs. Michigan, near the lakes. Used to swim in water so clear and cold that it would shock your system. She got a distant look in her eyes. Sometimes I dream about diving into that water, feeling it close over my head and washing all this desert dust away. So why'd you come out here to hell's front porch? I asked, biting into my hot dog. Even camp food tasted good when you were this tired and hungry. Same reason we all did, probably. Running from something, looking for something else. Desert's a good place to disappear if you need to, she said. Red joined the conversation, accepting a plate of beans and hot dogs. I need this money. Things are tight. I have a family. They're all waiting. Waiting for what? Xavier asked. Waiting for me to get my crap together. He chuckled, the first bit of warmth I'd heard in his voice. The food was warm, the fire was crackling, and the temperature had dropped to something almost comfortable. The stars were coming out in the clear desert sky, more stars than you ever see in town, stretching from horizon to horizon. You know what? Kate said, leaning back against her pack and looking more relaxed than I'd seen her all day. Maybe Red's right to be cautious, but we did good work today. That thing's been sitting down there for who knows how long, and we got it out clean. No cave-ins, no injuries, no major problems. Tomorrow, we load it up and drive back to civilization, and we all walk away 10 grand richer. I'll drink to that, Pedro said, raising his beer. We all clanked bottles and cans, even Red, though he still kept glancing at the tarp. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up into the desert night. And for a while there, it felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. Maybe we had actually pulled this off. Maybe Red was just being paranoid. Maybe those symbols on the sarcophagus were just some old indigenous art that meant nothing more than, here lies so-and-so, may you rest in peace. Man, we were so wrong it wasn't even funny. Underscore 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 underscore. I woke up at around 3 a.m., and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not a normal desert smell like smoke or dust. This was different. Unnatural, like chemicals mixed with vomit. The second thing I noticed was the light. There was this glow coming from under the tarp covering the sarcophagus. Not bright, just a dim pulse like a dying flashlight. But the color, man, I can't even describe it properly. It wasn't red or blue or green or any color that has a name. It was the color of fever dreams and bad acid trips. The color of things that couldn't and shouldn't exist. I sat up in my sleeping bag, rubbing my eyes, thinking maybe I was still dreaming. But it was real. The smell sharp enough to make me wince. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and everyone else was still asleep around the camp. Everyone except Pedro. Pedro. I whispered. His sleeping bag was empty. And that's when I heard it. A grinding sound like stone scraping against stone coming from under the tarp. Slow, deliberate, like something heavy being moved by something that didn't care about making noise. The glow under the tarp pulsed brighter, and the grinding got louder. I should have woken the others. Should have grabbed Kate and shaken her awake. Should have started yelling. Instead, I just sat there like an idiot, watching that impossible light seep through the canvas. And then the grinding stopped. The quiet that followed was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, thick and heavy and full of waiting. Something moved in the darkness beyond our camp. Something big. Pedro. I called out louder this time. My voice cracked like I was 12 years old again. A scream answered me from somewhere out in the lava fields, high, terrified, and human. It started as Pedro's voice. I'd know that voice anywhere after spending all day working next to the guy. But it changed as it went on. It got higher, more animalistic, like he was being torn apart while he made the sound. And then it cut off. The silence came back, and that awful smell, and that pulsing light under the tarp that hurt to look at. What the hell? Kate was sitting up now, reaching for the flashlight beside her sleeping bag. Don't, I whispered, but she was already switching it on, sweeping the beam across our campsite. The tarp had shifted. The sarcophagus was partially uncovered, and even in the dim light, I could see that the lid was open. Not just cracked open, but wide open, like the jaws of some stone predator. The symbols carved into the sides were glowing with that nameless color, pulsing in rhythms like a diseased heartbeat. Where is Pedro? Xavier was awake now too, his voice tight with fear. Another scream echoed from the darkness, further away this time. Definitely human at first, then dissolving into something else. Something wet and broken. Red was on his feet, grabbing his boots. We need to go. Right now. Go where? Kate demanded, but she was already moving, stuffing her sleeping bag into her pack. What is happening? A shadow moved at the edge of our firelight. Not the shadow of a person, too tall, too wide, and moving in ways that were hard to follow. The truck, Red said urgently. Get to the truck. But I couldn't move. I was staring at that open sarcophagus, at those glowing symbols, at the absolute darkness inside where something had been lying for God knows how long. The smell was getting worse, seeping into my pores and making my eyes burn, and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. That's when I heard Xavier scream. He was trying to run toward the truck when something massive erupted from the shadows. 1 second he was there, the next he was airborne, thrashing and yelling as something huge dragged him into the darkness. His screams echoed in the night, raw and getting fainter and more desperate until they turned into that same wet, animalistic bleeding sound I'd heard from Pedro. Run! Kate yelled. Everyone run! Red was already moving, sprinting toward the truck. I tried to follow, but my legs felt like jelly, and the oppressive darkness was making it hard to think and hard to breathe. Behind me, I could hear something large moving through the camp, displacing rocks, getting closer. I stumbled after Red, tripping over volcanic debris. He had maybe a 20-foot head start when the shadow caught him. I saw it happen in the corner of my eye, this massive dark shape flowing over the ground like a liquid nightmare. Red didn't even have time to scream before it wrapped around him and yanked him sideways into the darkness. There was a wet tearing sound like shredding meat, and then nothing. That got me moving faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I reached the truck just as Kate came running up from the other direction, her face a mask of terror in the starlight. She had the keys. Get it started, I said, throwing myself into the passenger seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, headlights cutting through the darkness. Where are they? She whispered. Where is everybody? I didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because I could see shapes moving in our headlight beams, strange shapes that shouldn't exist. And I knew exactly where everybody was. Go, I hissed. Kate put the truck in gear and started to drive, but we only made it about 50 yards before something slammed into the driver's side with enough force to tip us over. The truck slid, metal screaming against volcanic rock, before coming to rest on its side. My head cracked against the passenger window, and for a few seconds, everything went sparkly and dark. When my vision cleared, Kate was hanging in her seatbelt, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks, and something was moving outside. Jay, she whispered. Help me get out of the seatbelt. I tried to reach up, but my left arm wasn't working right, probably broken. Through the cracked windshield, I could see massive shadows circling the truck, patient and deliberate. Then the driver's side window exploded inward. Something dark and impossibly strong reached in from above through the broken glass and grabbed Kate by the shoulders. Her seatbelt snapped like tissue paper, and she started screaming as whatever had her began dragging her through the window frame, folding her like a lawn chair. Jay, she screamed, her face appearing in the truck's lights for just a second. Blood covered her features like a crimson mask, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Help me. But then something jerked her back into the darkness, and the screaming started in earnest, desperate at first, then dissolving into those same inhuman sounds of abject terror and pain I'd heard from the others. The sounds of being torn apart by something that took its time. I lay there in the overturned truck, listening to Kate die, too broken and terrified to move. The headlights were still on, pointed at crazy angles, illuminating patches of volcanic rock and shadow. And in those shadows, something moved, something big, something hungry, something that had been waiting in the dark for thousands of years. The screaming stopped. Everything went quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and my own panicked breathing. I waited there for what felt like hours, sure that any second something was going to reach through the broken windows and drag me out to join the others. But nothing happened. The shadows moved and shifted, but they kept their distance from the truck. Maybe it had had enough for one night. Or maybe it was just savoring the fear, letting me marinate in terror before the final course. I don't know why it didn't take me. But as the hours passed and the sky started to lighten, the shadows began to fade. By the time the sun came up, painting the desert in shades of golden red that reminded me too much of that impossible light under the tarp, I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. It took what felt like forever to crawl out of the truck. My left arm was definitely broken, and I was pretty sure I had a concussion, but I could walk, sort of. I grabbed a half-empty bottle of water and stood up. I must have been in shock when I started walking toward the road, leaving behind the overturned truck, the empty campsite, and the cursed sarcophagus with its lid hanging open like a stone mouth that had finally finished feeding. I walked for 2 hours in the desert heat before a state trooper found me, half dead from dehydration and babbling about monsters in the dark. They took me to the hospital, and for the better part of a day, a pair of grim-faced detectives asked me the same questions over and over, making it clear they thought I was either high, crazy, or a murderer. I told them we'd had an accident, a vehicle rollover. The others had wandered off in the dark looking for help, and they never came back. Search and rescue found the truck, but never found any bodies. They never found the box either. Or at least they didn't say. And then, just as they were getting ready to haul me to a county jail cell, he showed up. The pale man from the diner. He walked into my hospital room wearing a crisp black suit in defiance of the desert heat. He didn't say a word to me. Instead, he pulled the lead detective into the hallway. I saw him quietly show the detective some kind of identification in a leather wallet. The cop, who had been ready to charge me with 4 homicides, just went pale himself and nodded. A minute later, the detective came back in and told me I was free to go, that my story of a tragic camping accident had been corroborated. He couldn't get out of the room fast enough. The pale man stepped in as the cops left, his icy blue eyes fixing on me. He tossed a roll of cash on the bed. "$500 for your time," he said, voice like gravel scraped from the bottom of a well. The job wasn't completed. Completed. I croaked, trying to sit up. They're dead. They're all dead. What the hell was in that box? He didn't blink. Risk was part of the deal. You thought 10 grand was for a camping trip? My mouth was dry, throat raw. What was it? Who are you? What is this? His expression darkened. Too many questions. He took a step toward the door. "I've got a mess to clean up," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "And you don't want any of it landing on you." I stared at him. I was broke and confused, terrified. He paused, hand on the knob, and for the briefest second, something like pity flickered across his face. "Take the money. Leave town. Don't look back. Find somewhere to go, kid. Don't think too much." And then he was gone, leaving nothing but the antiseptic stink of the hospital and the weight of everything he didn't say. I used the money to buy a Greyhound ticket to Portland, as far from the desert as I could afford to get. I never got my 10 grand, but I got something else, the knowledge that there are things in the dark places of this world that make death look like a mercy. And sometimes, when the sun is setting low and orange and those clouds are lit up like cotton candy, I still have the dreams. Dreams about symbols that glow with colors that don't exist. About blood-covered faces in the dark and the sounds that people made when something ancient and hungry takes them. Survivor's guilt stays with you. I never went back to New Mexico. Never will. It's a hard lesson to learn, but some jobs don't pay enough no matter what the money looks like up front. And some things should definitely stay buried.